All right, it's time for another episode of Boardroom RevOps, where we're bringing you valuable tips from RevOps experts so you can make it to the C-suite. I'm James, co-founder of Accounting, the RevOps BI platform. Very happy to be joined by a friend of Accounting, Ben Mohlie, today. Good to have you on, Ben.
Oh, thank you. Nice to be here.
Ben's co-founder and CEO of Hyperscayle. They do a lot of great RevOps consulting work, but today we're going to talk about one focus area, quote to cash. But first, Ben, I think you're our first former physicist on the podcast, if memory serves, so I can't let you get by without giving us kind of a quick tour of your very varied background.
Sure. Yeah, it was a circuitous route to RevOps for sure. No, happy to be here. As you said, I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Hyperscayle. Alluding to the physics career, my first life after college, I was a physicist working for a defense contractor building toys for three-letter agency guys during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. Then I went to business school, then got into the startup scene after that, and through that kind of process of seeing sales and marketing teams in motion, got into the RevOps world, and started Hyperscayle about 4 years ago, I guess now, almost. We're coming up on 4 years. So I can give you a brief overview of Hyperscayle for the listeners, and then we can jump into the discussion of the day. So, as you said, we are a revenue operations consulting agency, and we choose the title revenue operations deliberately rather than sales ops or marketing ops or some other specialization. We have a very holistic view when it comes to revenue operations in our mind, it is inclusive of marketing ops, of sales ops, of customer success, account management, and of quote to cash, which is what we're going to talk about today. All of that is revenue operations, and we have some deep expertise across that whole spectrum. Also, I'll say we're pretty objective when it comes to technology. We've worked in lots of different platforms. We're Salesforce partners, we're HubSpot partners, we're Adobe partners, but we're not beholden to any one of them. We're not specialized in any one ecosystem. We can work with whatever people have. We do a lot of quote to cash projects. It's been a focus area for us for a couple years now. So I'm happy to dive in and talk more about it.
Awesome. It's great to have you. And irony's not lost to me that it might take a physicist to finally figure out how to do quote to cash.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't claim I got it figured out, so I don't know. There's a lot to it for sure.
For sure. It's one of the most complicated things I hear about is in the market too. Maybe just starting at the highest level, why is quote to cash so important for companies? And I think you served, some bigger companies out there too. So why do they really care about it?
Yeah, I mean, the cash is in the name, right? It's close to the money. This is the process by which you give quotes to your customers, you price your products, make those sales, and then recognize the revenue, right? So it's really right in the core of a business operating, and is very important both to CROs and other sales leaders, and then also CFOs, right? It's kind of the in between their two worlds. And so for all those reasons, companies care a lot about it, right? Now, I'll say CPQ, which stands for Configure Price Quote, right? It's an acronym for software or processes that allow a seller usually, but whomever is doing it at the company, to build a quote in an accurate way with the right pricing and the right combinations of SKUs and give that to a client with confidence. Then once it's closed, integrate that with the finance process, whatever that is, and hand over the sales order, which then turns into invoices, which turns into revenue, right? What I'll say is that is not every company needs CPQ, right? It's dependent on industry and it's dependent on company size, right? If you're a 20-person software startup, you don't need CPQ, right? You probably got two sellers, the pricing's changing every other week anyway. Anything like this would be overkill, right? Where CPQ really starts to make sense is kind of in the upper mid-market, lower enterprise, 100 million to 500 million of revenue, right? Maybe you could argue it's a little bit lower or higher than that, but something like that. Because at that scale, you've got, dozens of sellers usually, right? Maintaining, consistent pricing and discounting and approvals and everything across that becomes more complicated. And so, a system and a process around quote to cash becomes really valuable at that point. The other thing I'll say too, and just in why is it valuable, I think it is useful in software companies of that size, but I think even at a smaller size, if you're selling physical goods, I think it's even more important. When we spend a lot of time here at Hyperscayle talking about and focused on, not just Silicon Valley, right? Manufacturing companies and distribution, people in the distribution value chain, and all of the kind of unsexy, just the nuts and bolts of how our society runs, companies that are doing that. And it's actually even more important when you're selling physical goods, because often you have a lot more SKUs to deal with, right? If you take an oil and gas, parts distributor, right? Like, which is one of our customers, and they're managing an inventory of a few thousand SKUs at any given time, right? Of this fitting with this pipe and this hose, right? Whatever it is, and they have to go together in a certain combination. If you sell the wrong combination, it gets there and the client can't use it, right? And so it really matters. It's harder than if you're a software company where you got one platform, you hit the enter key and you make a new copy of your product, and like you have one SKU and that's it, right? Like,
yeah, if you're on the wrong plan, it's okay. That's an easy fix.
Yeah,
Like,
then you just change it the next day, right? The
no
CS
margin.
team switches you to the right plan. Like, it's very different. And so, long way of saying like why quote to cash is important is like for small companies, most of them don't need it. For medium-sized software companies, you start to need it, right? Just because of the size of the sales team, and you do start to have different SKUs and things. But even at a smaller size, I think physical goods and manufacturing, distribution, things like that, it becomes even more important, right, at that stage.
Really well put. You kind of started to allude to this in the description of like where quote to cash really matters and why it's important. But like, what are some symptoms or challenges that folks might be feeling where they might realize, okay, maybe I need some like maybe internal or external help on the quote to cash front?
Yeah. So the business problems that usually start a conversation around quote to cash are. There's a number of them. First and foremost, the time to get quotes out the door is often a pain point for sales teams. Either because if you are in a situation where your quoting is complicated, then it takes a long time to do that, and the sellers are trying to get it right, so they want to spend their time to make sure that it's accurate. And then usually, if you don't have CPQ, a company will still have like some kind of checking system in place that slows things down. Okay, I'm going to build a quote, and then I'm going to send it to this engineer, and the engineer has to look at it and make sure that I'm putting the right parts together, right? Which takes time, and then business, and they're on vacation, and then like a week goes by, right? And the customer is like, "Where's my quote?" Right? It really makes it harder to do business with you. It'll cost you deals. It'll cost you money, right? So that's the first area of it takes us a week, 2 weeks to get quotes out the door. Our competitors are doing it in a day. Like we're getting killed out here, right? Like we hear that a lot. The other thing too is the accuracy of the quotes, like we talked about. Quoting the wrong things or missing parts on it, or even just missing the opportunity to do more add-ons and increase the size of the sale, right? Not being prompted to think about, this other, you might want this other widget if you've bought these other things, right? And a lot of the times the customer's like, oh yeah, sure, but if you don't prompt the salesperson, they might miss it, right? So that's another area where it manifests. And then the kind of flip side of that is like the pain comes from when you get it wrong. We talked about how you might send the wrong parts out to people. Usually what that means is that you then end up sending the correct parts for free, right? In my experience, like it's rare. You got to be a pretty big, powerful company to like send the wrong stuff and then be like, oh, sorry, you got to pay me for the new stuff too, right? Like that in practice, that doesn't really happen, right? What happens is they're like, oh no, we sent the wrong things. What we sold them literally doesn't work the way it's set up, so they end up sending their free parts, and that's often adds up to many millions of dollars for even a modest sized company. We've seen that firsthand, where literally it's $7, $8, $9 million of just literally wasted money of free inventory going out the door every year only because they can't quote correctly. So when you're talking about those kind of numbers, justifying the expenditure of a CPQ system and getting it set up is pretty easy, right? To justify. So that's what I'd say there. And then the last reason that these conversations come up is from the finance side. Of they're if they're frustrated about the ability to move sales orders over from the CRM in a consistent way. How do they do invoicing if they're selling a subscription service, right? Like having the entitlements correct and the renewal dates and all that stuff. A CPQ system helps a lot with that too, of just being that bridge between the CRM and the ERP usually. And so that's the other area where someone might raise their hand and say, hey, I want to put in a CPQ system or process, right? So that's what I'd say in terms of that.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think it's such good examples of how close to the money quote to cash is. Because I'm kind of envious of you in a position, selling quote to cash projects. Of like, there's some very rich discovery questions in there around like money leaking out of the funnel, right?
It's funny. Sometimes people are like, "Oh no, everything's fine," and then you dig into discovery, right, and you show it to them, and then it's like it's a difficult thing because they don't want to admit that it's as bad as it is. And sometimes you start that conversation, and people are like, "Please God, tell me how to fix this, right? It's terrible." So it's it varies, right? But yeah, I enjoy and our team enjoys these projects because they're complex and they're challenging because we'll talk about it, I'm sure, later, but it touches so many different systems and different parts of the organization. So they're interesting, and also they're really valuable, right? It's not some ethereal thing of how much is this worth? We're not sure. Like, you can usually make a pretty good business case that's pretty tight, and that feels really good to know that you're adding that value to the clients. So
Yeah, and for listeners too, like consulting aside, you think about making an impact in RevOps, like great way to show like positive ROI here.
Oh, sure, yeah. If you're a RevOps leader and you are seeing these business problems, this is a great thing to like raise your hand and become the champion of like, we need to do this, because if you get it right and you pull it off, the sales team's going to be like materially happy, the CFO is going to be materially happy, right? Like, it really has an impact across a number of folks, right? And it directly, be like, yeah, I saved the company, this many dollars, right? And it's probably going to be a big number. So
Totally. Yeah, that's great. You mentioned a lot of potential symptoms in kind of the intro. You mentioned a lot of component parts of quote to cash. It's very big. Like, where the heck do people start as they think about improving quote to cash? I imagine you kind of maybe, my guess would be you start where the pain is, but maybe that's not actually true. Maybe there's foundations that need to happen upstream. So how do you think about like scoping the solve here?
yeah, I would say you don't start with the pain, the symptoms. You start with the product and price books, actually. Mm-hmm. So it's not sexy. Most people don't think a lot about it, but at the root, one of the root causes often of the challenges around quoting without a robust quote to cash system is not having consistent price books, either across geographies, sometimes across business units, but also even across like the CRM and the ERP. Very commonly, if you don't have a CPQ system and you haven't thought through a quote to cash, you'll have product books that don't match up, right? Which creates all kinds of problems and pain. There's SKUs that are in the ERP that aren't in the CRM, or vice versa, and then they quote it and they sell these SKUs, and then they go over to accounting, and accounting's like, what do I do with this? Like, we don't have this in the ERP, and it's really painful, right? So that can be that can be a challenge. And then I think the other piece about the challenges of getting those systems to talk to each other too is like and where to start, right, is the process by which your humans are approving and signing off on deals. So that's another piece too of like, that's valuable whether or not you have a quote to cash project or a CPQ system, right? But you need to know how much can a seller discount for these SKUs in this combination in this geography. Are we running a promotion on this? Or in many cases, hey, this distributor has a different price book than the other one because they've negotiated a better deal. And you have to make sure all of that flows, right? And so it's starting with that process of like, what is the approval? Who has to say yes to a discount of X percentage, of Y percentage? Making sure there's not too many people in that process, which is usually what we see when we come in. Of there's 20 approvers, which is part of why quotes take so long to go out the door, right? And so there's a lot of opportunity there. Of even before you start talking about the technology and putting hands on keyboard for any CPQ system, it's price book, product book, making sure you know what you're selling, and then making sure you know what the process is by which you're going to decide how much you're going to sell it for, the discounting and approval. And that's where I'd start most times, because most people don't have that. If you do have it, then great. You can jump right to the more fun stuff of starting to talk about workflows and the automation and ERP integration and all those. But the foundation actually needs to happen first, of just having those basic business assets, so that you got something solid to build on.
Yeah, I'm sure it's really contextual based on company size, industry, you name it. But any like best practices or tactics you've seen for those two things? So you mentioned kind of price book, product portfolio, and then also like the approval workflows. Like, do you find there's is it a committee approach on the price books, or more of like we just need one source of truth? Is there a certain sweet spot of number of approvers, and any kind of like benchmarks there that you've seen work well?
Yeah, so it's a deep topic in its own right. What I'd say on the price book, product book side is, one, it's something that has to come out of your product management team first, right? So that's not something usually that a RevOps person sits down and just writes it out, right? That's not their job. That's not their responsibility, right? They need the product owners, whatever that looks like in your organization, to tell them this is the list of things that we're selling, right? And the combination in which you can sell them. So that's another, we talked earlier about how a quote to cash project touches so many different parts of the organization. That's one good example of, put sales to the side, put finance to the side. The product group has to actually be where this starts, of even just defining that in a clear, concise, and consistent way. And that's something that a RevOps leader needs to partner with them to do. Mm-hmm. The next thing I'd say is, in terms of price book and product book, is deciding on the process by which they will be kept up to date. Mm-hmm. So when you do a quote to cash process, for a moment in time, you get the CRM price book in sync with the ERP, right? If you're doing it correctly. However, no matter how good you do that, and you can have the integrations between the two systems, things like adding a new SKU or taking out a SKU still have to be done in both systems, like with very few exceptions, right? Like you have to manually go in to your ERP and make an adjustment and then make the same adjustment in the CRM and make sure you're not screwing it up. And you need to have a process by which you're going to manage that. Who's responsible for it? What are the checks, right? Who has to approve the addition or removal of a SKU, right? What's the, having a committee to review it of the downstream implications, right? Of, existing customers that have already bought the SKU. How are we going to account for that? Things like that. And that's really important to think through, right? And have in place. So for the price book and product book, that's what I'd say there. And then, for the approval process, in terms of discounting and everything, I mean, that's honestly a decision company by company of how much autonomy how much do you discount in general? What's your strategy there? And how much autonomy do you want to give to your, first line sales leaders and or sales reps themselves? There's no one answer to that, right? It varies by company and by industry, but whatever the answer is, my advice would just be figure that out first before you jump into a quote to cash process, and don't underestimate the amount of kind of horse wrangling that has to happen to get an agreement on that, because especially if you're pulling back permissions and requiring more approvals, people aren't going to be pleased with that. Sales leader in region X revolts and is like, I'm not doing this, and you want to bring them along, and it takes another month of consensus building. And so do all that first, right, before you launch into a quote to cash project, because otherwise it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, super helpful. Okay, so what's next? That's the kind of the foundation that you laid out. Is it then time to go into systems and workflows, or kind of what's the next phase?
Yeah, I mean, I think then you're talking about technology selection, right? So we've got you got your product books. Inherent in that is what you can sell in which combinations, how are you going to discount it, et cetera. Those are the main inputs. And once you have that, you can start thinking about, okay, which technology am I going to use for quote to cash, right? And for some simple situations, again, quote to cash, you don't have to have a CPQ system to have a quote to cash process, right? If you're a simple business that sells a few number of things, you can still have a quote to cash process, but parts of it might be in Excel, and that might be okay for you, right? We're firm believers here in not overcomplicating things. But again, for those larger software companies and kind of mid-market manufacturing companies, it makes a lot of sense, right? In terms of the need to have that. So I think in terms of how to get started after you have the foundations, technology selection is the next one. And there's a number of options on the market, right? Now, what I'll say is that Salesforce has been the behemoth for quite some time in this space, at least in the worlds that we operate. Again, kind of mid-market to enterprise software, mid-market to enterprise manufacturing. Other industries, maybe there's more niche players, right? But that's the world that we're mostly in. And up to recently, that product it's called Salesforce CPQ. It was formerly a company, Steelbrick, that Salesforce acquired, right? Mm-hmm. And the reason I bring that up is that what they've just done a few months ago is they've said, hey, we're end of selling Salesforce CPQ. They're not going to sell it anymore. It's not technically end of life, but that's obviously coming, right, in however much time. And now they've got a new product that they've released, the Salesforce Revenue Cloud, which is natively built on Salesforce and has all the functionality of CPQ, pretty much. But also it gives you billing and entitlements and invoicing, and you're required now to buy a package that's a lot larger, right? So they're trying to upsell people by, okay, now in order to get CPQ, you have to buy this overall package and do more of it in Salesforce, right? So the reason I bring all that up is technology selection in the enterprise. For quite a while, I would have said Salesforce CPQ is kind of the default choice. There are other great platforms out there too, Deal Hub and Zora, and there's lots of other options too, but that's been the majority of customers that we work with already have Salesforce or Salesforce CPQ. So that's often to begin with. But I think choosing that technology matters because they do have different sets and functionality, right? You have to decide how much complexity you need. Do you need to buy a Salesforce Revenue Cloud, or can you get by with a Deal Hub, right? Or another kind of more straightforward provider. Again, don't do overkill, right? Don't buy a Ferrari if you just need a Ford Focus to get to work, right? So just make sure you know what you're getting into. And so I think that technology selection is the next decision, because that'll lead you down the different implementation paths, right? Of, okay, can we do this ourselves? Do we need outside help, right? How long is this going to take? How much is it going to cost? That's when you start to figure that out after you select a technology, right? And go from there. So yeah, that's what I'd say in kind of the next step.
Yeah, super helpful. And you kind of got right to my next question, is the challenge of implementation. I've heard a lot of horror stories about the sheer amount of time this can take sometimes. What are the top, 1, 2, 3 places that people get just hung up on implementation? Any kind of gotchas in there that might surprise someone that hasn't gone through this before?
Yeah, so the first ones we've actually already talked about is the price book, product
Okay.
book, and approval workflows. So often people jump right into the building automation in, Salesforce or Deal Hub or whatever it is. And 4 months later, they realize, oh, people don't even, like, we built this whole thing and people don't agree that this is how it needs to work.
Got it.
And then the project gets stalled and, like,
Alignment
somebody's
issue.
raising a fit
Yeah.
and why wasn't I consulted? And they have to go back and do a bunch of rework and it just gets ugly, right? And that happens a lot of people skip those steps. They don't have that firm answer, and then they're building on sand, effectively, or whatever analogy you want to use, right? And then that dramatically slows things down, creates a lot of rework, and why projects often take 9 months or 12 months, right, to do this, even in not a huge company, right? That's the biggest reason. The complexity of using the systems themselves, like make sure you got someone who knows what they're doing, right? Like the CPQ is a skill set in its own right. Quote to cash is a skill set in its own right. So, if you've got people on your team that have done this before and kind of really understand that process, great. Like they, make sure they've got the resources they need to do it. And if you don't, make sure you've got outside help that does have that expertise, right? To be able to make sure this goes well because, it's an enterprise software skill set in its own right. And actually, up until recently, Salesforce CPQ was kind of a skill set in its own right, even within Salesforce, because again, it was this other company they bought, and under the hood, just like it would never work quite the same as wider Salesforce. Like, just flows work differently, and some of the automation and like the data model, and it was Salesforce, but part of the reason they're doing Revenue Cloud is that it wasn't natively built, right? So there was some weirdness that would happen when you really got under the
Just
hood.
a
And
few
then you
differences
have
is
that skill
almost
set.
worse than like complete differences, right? It's like you think you know how it should work and it just doesn't
Exactly.
quite do
Yeah.
it.
You're like, why isn't this working? And actually, that's a good. I wasn't even thinking about this when I started answering your question, but another way that people specifically with Salesforce CPQ went awry is they got in there. They knew they have some people that really know Salesforce. They got in there. They started doing CPQ, and it's close enough that you can get pretty far, right? Like you know enough to be dangerous. The keyword dangerous. And then they get to a point where they can't figure out how to do a given piece of functionality the way it's supposed to be done in CPQ, and they end up building Apex code to go do it manually, right? And it works for a time, but then that person retires or goes to another company or something, and then like, how does this Apex code work? And no clue. So we've seen that multiple times, right? Of how things can go sideways. And then the last thing I'd say in terms of pitfalls to avoid is think through carefully the integration with the ERP, and don't underestimate the work required there. Again, the most common situation we're seeing in our clients, and again with the caveats of the size of company we work with and the industries we're in, is you've got Salesforce for CRM, you've got Salesforce CPQ, now Revenue Cloud for quote to cash, and then you've got NetSuite for your ERP, right? You could have Sage, you could have something else, but mostly NetSuite in that RAM. You're not big enough to have SAP yet, right? You have NetSuite. So I can speak specifically to that world, right? But I would imagine the same thing's probably true for SAP and everything at a larger scale. Is that integration, is the out of the box connectors don't work very well, right? Just is what I'd say. They're okay for standard objects. If you're doing something really simple of sales order goes from here to there in NetSuite, and then NetSuite picks it up and does the process. Okay, that's fine. But if you have anything that's non-standard of a discounting field that's passed over or other custom objects, you have to basically build a custom API to make it work. And also, if you're doing a subscription business, like if you're a SaaS business or if you're, even a hardware business that also sells software on top of things, the NetSuite module that does that has a separate API, actually. That's even a different protocol. It's one's REST, one's SOAP. I forget which one it is. But so you have to build a second API to just even get it to work because they don't talk to each other otherwise, right? So those are just some of the things that can come up with. And so you got to select, and you need middleware to get that done, right? Like you can't do that just from Salesforce to NetSuite. You generally need something like a MuleSoft, which Salesforce would love to sell you. You need a Boomi, you need a Celigo, something like that. So that's a whole other software expenditure, right? And a whole other skill set you need to implement it. And so don't underestimate that piece of it, of getting the integration set between the CRM and the ERP. And that's a project in its own right a lot of the time. The answer often to begin with is you actually just keep it manual at first, right? You do the CPQ in best practice. And again, we err on the side of pragmatism of probably today they've got someone swivel seating already between CRM and ERP of the sales order closed and then they turn over here, I'm going to move it over to the ERP, and that works, right? It's time intensive. It doesn't scale past a certain point, but that can work. And so if you're starting from scratch, CPQ by itself is a big undertaking. Get that working first. And then don't underestimate the time of this is a project in its own right to select a middleware, to get it set up correctly, to quality, test it. You're going to find fringe data cases that break the API, right, that you didn't think about. It happens all the time, right? So that'd be the other gotcha, I would say, of where things can go sideways, is underestimating the complexity of that and the need for it.
I feel like that's such good advice to do kind of the crawl, walk, run first. I think the crawl is probably get the price and product books together and the decisions made on workflow, maybe walk to just get like the CPQ going and then running or sprinting is with all like the integrations connected. It's probably a good way to
I think that's a good analogy. Yeah.
We're almost at time, Ben. This has been awesome. I want to ask around like the analytics that folks can use to assess and iterate on their process on an ongoing basis. But before I do, is there anything else that I missed in terms of like the process of quote to cash? Anything else really important that we didn't cover if folks are trying to paint a picture of kind of what it takes today?
No, I mean, I think you have really good questions. I mean, those are the main, pieces of advice I would give people in terms of thinking about this. Again, I think the biggest thing is make sure you don't wait too long to get it, and also make sure you don't put it in too early, because it is a big undertaking, and adding complexity to the end of the sales process if you don't need it will be counterproductive, right? Like the point of doing this is to make it easier for people to do business with your business, right? That's why you have quote to cash. And if you're a small company where this is just going to add overhead of time and effort, then you're actually doing more harm than good a lot of the time by putting in something like this. So, as much as we love to do quote to cash projects, like my other advice would be like, take a step back and make sure you really need it at this point, right? And if you do, okay, great, then to go start making those plans, right? But you may not, at least yet. So, other than that, James, I think we covered all the major points that I would have dived into. So.
Cool. Then how about just analytics are near and dear to my heart as the co-founder of Accounting. How can folks like monitor their quote to cash process on an ongoing basis? Maybe it's not something that really lends itself to quantitative analytics. I'm sure there's a small piece, so maybe there's a qualitative element too. But how should folks, once implement it, kind of like monitor and iterate?
So a lot of it is qualitative in terms of the impact, right? But you can measure. So the time to create a quote, right, should be dramatically improved if you're going from not having one of these systems to having the system. That's part of the reason for it. The accuracy of that quote should also be increased, and perhaps even the close rate of those deals, because you're moving it quickly and it's correct the first time, and that matters, right? So normal metrics in terms of win rate and everything, before and after, right, and deals that use CPQ or versus deals that didn't. That would be one of the first pieces of analytics, just to sanity check that it's having the baseline effect that you expect, right? However, I would also partner that with lots of interviews with the salespeople and like call recordings and anecdotes of like, okay, is this actually making their lives easier? Yeah. Don't just look at the soulless dashboard, right? Go talk to the humans too. That's what I'd say there. And then for other analytics, I think some of the things we touched on earlier are measurable, like $0 sales orders, right? That's often how sending out free stuff manifests. Of we messed up the order, now we're sending another $0. We zeroed out the numbers, and we got 500 of the right widgets now, and that goes out. You can measure that. You can measure what the inventory value of those widgets are, right? How much are we going out the door? And so that's another great place of analytics of both before and after. Hey, this is what it's costing us today, and then afterwards, it might not drop to zero, but it should go down significantly, and you can look at the delta, right? So nothing crazy there, but I think it's useful. And then other analytics, I think, even just something as simple as what percentage of like renewal rates on subscriptions and things. CPQ can actually help with that. Quote to cash can help with that, because it's closely related to tracking subscriptions and when do the renewal dates come up. And if you get this integration well set up between the CRM and the ERP, you can have automatic reminders of like, hey, these guys are up for renewal in 3 months, Mr. Salesperson or Mrs. Salesperson. Go talk to them about that. Make sure they're in a good spot. Make sure do they need to buy anything extra, et cetera. And so that's something you can measure, right, in terms of how that's happening. So that's what I'd say for analytics. This isn't an area where it's more about the impact on the way the humans are doing their jobs rather than a better metric and a dashboard. But those are some areas that you can measure that are pretty quantifiable and are often at the core of a business case for why CPQ makes sense. And so definitely think that through, have that set up ahead of time, and be armed if you're a RevOps leader. Measure it today, right? That's maybe step one before any of this other stuff, just to even highlight that it is a problem, right? Like that $0 sales order thing. If you know that's happening and no one's looking at it or talking about it, you can probably measure it pretty quickly, and you can be like, look, guys, we sent $3 million out the door last year for free. Why don't we spend a few $100,000 to not do that anymore? Right?
Yeah,
and it starts to so that might be where you begin, and again the analytics can elicit that conversation, right? And then after the fact, make sure you're looking at how it's changed and how it comes down over time, et cetera. So that's what I'd say for the kind of the analytics side.
Awesome, Ben. Sadly, we're at time. This is awesome. I definitely feel much more edified on quote to cash. Anyone listening, if you're thinking about quote to cash at all, I'm sure Ben would be happy to chat. I can speak from experience. He's awesome, super helpful. Any final plugs, Ben, on how Hyperscayle can help? I think we touched on a little bit in the beginning, but anything else to add before we break?
No, I mean, not this isn't a pitch session, right? But yes, full service revenue operations agency, quote to cash is definitely a specialty for us. But we do everything from marketing ops, sales ops, all the way down. So happy to talk if anyone's got problems in that area.
Awesome. Thanks a lot for joining, Ben. It's awesome.
Okay, thanks, James.